Did you want the clicker for your slides?
Okay. We really need to get moving. We're a little bit behind time.
I feel like all of the bits are
All right, well, of course, this is a conference about sustainable prosperity, and for very obvious reasons, one of the main issues that's been discussed and mentioned is climate change. And of course, to resolve the climate change crisis, it's going to be necessary to rapidly shift from fossil fuels to renewable energy. And of course, the question that everyone seems to ask when the issue of renewables comes up is, can we shift towards renewables at the rate required to prevent catastrophic climate change? Well, our next speaker, Associate Professor Mark Diesendorf, will answer this question for us. Mark is currently Associate Professor at the University of New South Wales and is best known as an environmentalist and for his work in sustainable development and renewable energy. Mark was the founding director of the Institute for Sustainable Futures at the University of Technology in Sydney, and before that a principal research scientist with the CSIRO, where he was involved in research on integrating wind power into electricity grids. Mark has had his large body of work published in books, both authored and edited, in academic journals and in numerous commissioned reports. One of his works is the very important book, Sustainable Energy Solutions for Climate Change. We are fortunate to have Mark enlighten us on such an important and vexing issue. Could you please welcome Mark to the stage?
Thanks very much, Phil. Can you hear me at the back? Right on. Okay, so I'm going to talk about energy, and energy is the basis of industrial society. It turns the wheels of industry and of transportation, and it makes this conference possible. Ecologically sustainable energy, together with transformed agriculture, can be the technical basis for an ecologically sustainable society. It can be the start of a Green New Deal, but it can go much further. In the interdisciplinary field of energy, we already have most of the technologies that we need to go to an energy efficient society based on 100% renewable energy. What we lack is the non-technical side. We lack, for example, an electricity market with an appropriate objective structure and rules that's relevant to the kind of system we have today. We lack appropriate business models for the new transformed institutions. We lack systems of governance which can facilitate a smooth, just and prosperous transition. So the plan of my talk is I'll first speak briefly about the needs of climate science, the kind of scenarios we need to deal with the crisis in climate at present. And then I'll look at an energy sector based on energy efficiency and renewable energy, but because of time constraints, I'm going to focus on refuting two myths that the opponents or the critics of renewable energy are spreading around. And these myths are being disseminated by some politicians, and you'll be familiar with them, and by a large segment of the media. And it isn't only News Limited, I have to say. Okay, so very quickly, climate science. These are the scenarios that science tells us we need. The rising curves on the left-hand side are where we were, and the falling curves on the right-hand side is where we need to be. The blue curve, the dark blue curve, is where we need to go roughly to meet a 2-degree scenario, to keep the Earth's average temperature below 2 degrees with a probability of 66%. The bottom grey line is the 1.5 degree scenario. The horizontal light blue line at the top is where current policies and NDCs, national declared contributions, would get the world or what they're doing at present. Okay, now what are the implications? First thing is to say that if we want to go on a global scale to 1.5 degrees, and now I'm going to just focus on carbon dioxide, we have probably about 340 gigatons, billion tonnes of carbon dioxide left that we can emit. And at the current rate of emission, 37.5 gigatons per year across the world, that gives us 8 years. Now that figure of 340 gigatons is under hot debate. It could be much less than that, particularly when we take non-CO2 emissions into account. That lifts the annual global emissions to maybe about 55 gigatons per year. And so, but the implications are quite clear. We can't have any more coal-fired power stations. We can't have any more motor cars burning fossil fuels. And we have to get rid of these fossils as soon as possible. What about Australia? Well, there are really two ways of working out Australia's share of this global carbon budget, and the way which is most generous to the big polluters in Australia is grandfathering, which means that our share of the remaining budget is based on our current emissions share, which is about 1.4% of global emissions. So we're about number 15 in terms of global emitters. And in that case, our budget remaining from the end of 2019 becomes about 15 gigatons for 2 degree limit and just under 5 gigatons for 1.5 degree limit. In other words, we would have 30 years or 9 years at current emissions rate. So grandfathering gives us the most time, but it is unfair to people in other countries because we're one of the biggest per capita emitters in the world. Another way of calculating it is on the basis of population. Each person in the world is allocated the same amount of remaining emissions. On that basis, we only have 0.33% of global budget, or 3.5 gigatons for 2 degrees limit, or 1.5 gigatons for 1.5 degree limit. So that leaves us 7 years for 2 degrees and 2 years of current emissions for the 1.5 degree. So we've pretty well used up our budget on that basis. I'll just show you quickly this. You can study the diagram at leisure. This is a study that we did at UNSW and published in 2018, where we were looking at just the electricity sector and making very conservative assumptions, and we used a grandfathering approach in this case. And the good news from that study was we took in the life cycle emissions, so the fossil fuel emissions involved in actually building the renewable electricity system. And the emissions for building the renewable electricity system turned out to be very much less than the emissions saved by making the transition. That was the good news. But what you can see there are 22 scenarios. And the bad news is that only one of the scenarios came close to meeting the 1.5 degree target for Australia's share in electricity. And that scenario required us to have 98% of our electricity renewable by 2030 and massive improvements in energy efficiency. So the magnitude of the task is huge. The red line, the horizontal red line, marks the 2 degree budget, and you can see a number of the scenarios did get under the 2 degree budget. Okay, now what can we do? We now are in a position where we have a choice. We have the technologies in most cases. In most cases, the technologies are actually cheaper than building new fossil fuel systems. Wind and solar farms in particular now are cheaper, much cheaper than new coal-fired power stations, and they are already creating thousands of new jobs. The number of jobs created by solar energy alone in Australia is more than the number of jobs in coal mining and coal-fired electricity generation in Australia related to use of coal within Australia. So, of course, most of our coal is exported, and there's probably about 30 or 40,000 direct jobs for export coal. But if we substitute for coal with renewables, we already have more jobs in renewables in Australia than coal use in Australia. So to sum up, we need to transition to an ecologically sustainable energy system, and that has two components: the reduction of wasteful energy demand by energy efficiency and conservation, and the transition to renewable energy. So this is the official picture of Australia's greenhouse gas emissions for the year ending September 2018. And if you're close enough to read the figures, the biggest component is electricity, which is about 34%, followed by heat, non-electrical heat, which is 19%, then transport, also about 19%, and fugitive emissions, their emissions from coal mines and gas fields and so on, about 11%. Now, some people say, well, why bother transforming electricity? It's only 34% of our emissions. But the point is really that in the future, because electricity is the easiest and cheapest form of energy to transition to renewables, most heat and most transport will be produced from renewable electricity. So if you add up those components, you find that all energy is actually producing 82% of our emissions. So energy is critical. Agriculture, according to the standard analysis, is about 13%. So some scientists would be a bit puzzled by the statement in 2040 last night that agriculture has the most emissions. But it really depends on the assumptions that you make. So most energy can be provided by renewable electricity, and the main areas that are still challenging are air and sea transport, because we can't directly fly large jet aircraft, whether they're passenger or freight, directly on renewable electricity with solar panels on their wings. We need to first use renewable electricity to produce a fuel like hydrogen or a hydrogen compound like ammonia. So that's proceeding more slowly. So an energy transition strategy in broad terms is really clear. And I noticed in this morning's Guardian that even Malcolm Turnbull seems to have assimilated it, and it's very simple. Number one, rapidly replace fossil-fueled electricity with renewable electricity, and then replace fossil fuels in heating and most transport with renewable electricity, either directly or indirectly. Greatly increase energy efficiency, assist the workers in fossil fuel and other industries that are disadvantaged by the transition. Now that's one thing that Malcolm omitted, but is very important and is quite feasible. And develop an Australian industry to export renewable electricity in the form of hydrogen or a hydrogen compound, in which the hydrogen or hydrogen compound is produced by using renewable electricity. And of course we can also use these renewable fuels in Australia. So that's the broad strategy, and it's really it's very simple to state. And Australia has probably got one of the best, if not the best, renewable energy resource potentials in the whole world. We've got huge amounts of solar, huge amounts of wind. We've got limited conventional hydroelectric resources, but we have huge resources potential for pumped hydro, off-river pumped hydro, which Andrew Blakers and his colleagues at ANU have demonstrated. So we've got the resources, and we have no excuse for not proceeding. The economics of going to 100% renewables now are excellent. Lazard is a multinational investment consultancy, financial institution that advises investors, large corporate investors, on where to put their money, and they produce each year what they call the unsubsidised levelised costs of electricity in the USA. Now you mightn't be able to see these from the back, but basically solar, utility scale solar and wind are anything from 2.5 to 5 times cheaper than the nuclear power, and substantially cheaper, in many cases half the price of coal-fired power. If we come to Australia, CSIRO and AEMO, the Australian Energy Market Operator, which are not exactly radical greenies, have done their calculations each year, and they find that wind and solar, I don't have a pointer, so I'm just going to refer you to this and hope the slides will be available for you afterward if you want to follow up. Wind and solar are already much cheaper than new coal and gas, but CSIRO and AEMO have added in storage as well. So if you add 2 hours of battery storage or 6 hours of pumped hydro storage, this lifts the cost of the renewables to approximately the same as new coal and gas by 2030 we're talking about. So clearly, and the other thing to say is, of course, the prices of solar and wind are still coming down. And as you will hear, solar photovoltaics has dropped in price 90% approximately in the past 10 years. Wind about 30% in the past decade. This is in real terms. Okay, so now that renewable energy has actually won the conventional economics argument, it's being challenged on ecological economics arguments, at least by some authors. And we've done some research at New NSW examining the claims, and the claims are that the energy return on energy invested, EROI, of renewable electricity technologies may be very low compared with fossil fuels, and actually declining. And one of the papers is by Sears and Peter Victor, whom I admire greatly for his work on the macroeconomics of the steady-state economy. So we thought we'd have a look at that, because the implications are, if it's true, it may displace considerable investment in other important economic sectors. And one paper has actually phrased it as the transition to renewable electricity could cause complete industrial societies to collapse. Okay, so that's a serious claim. Tommy Wigman and I have a paper under review, and we are arguing that the claims are wrong. Now, just a little bit of definitions. We talk about the net energy gain is the energy output from a technology minus the life cycle energy invested. Obviously, we want the net energy gain to be positive, and we define EROI, the energy return on energy invested, as the energy output divided by the life cycle energy invested. And you can draw a graph of the net energy gain expressed as a percentage of the energy output, and you see that graph, the top of the blue area, as a function of EROI. So what it shows is when as EROI goes down to 1, the net energy gain goes essentially to 0, but for EROI greater than about 8 or 10, you have a high energy gain. That's probably all we need to know about that. Okay, now, what's the basis? Sears and Victor used a meta-analysis by a group of other authors, Hall et al., and these authors averaged the EROIs of renewable technologies over several decades. Now, over that period, the price of wind and solar have dropped hugely. Solar, I don't know, something like 98% or something, and wind about 50 or 60% over the three decades that they took. And it's quite invalid, of course, to use such an average, because the declining price of the renewables to a large degree reflects the increase in energy output per square metre of collector and the decrease in energy invested per square metre. So EROI has been increasing. It's hard to exactly quantify it, but some authors have done that. So it's a serious flaw. But there's another serious flaw in the conventional approach, and that is failure to take into account the very low efficiency of converting coal in a power station, coal, oil or gas, or anything you burn in a power station, to electricity. If you take 100 units of energy as the primary energy that's chemically in the coal, oil or gas, you can burn it in a power station. Typically your losses will be 70%, 70 units or more. So you end up with about 30 units of electricity. If you burn brown coal, as in Victoria, which is mostly dirt and water, you end up maybe with 20 units, or 20, 25 if you're lucky, of electricity. So most of the energy is waste heat at the power station, and there's some modest losses in the transmission line also for the electricity. So if you can replace 1 unit of electricity from fossil fuel burning with renewables or with energy efficiency, you save typically 3 units, sometimes 4 units of primary energy, and it's primary energy that produces the greenhouse gas emissions. So those efficiencies have to be taken into account. And in the calculation of energy return on energy investment, that means that the energy output should not be calculated as the electricity output, but the primary energy that the electricity substitutes for, because the whole purpose of the calculation is to cut greenhouse gas emissions. So when you do that, and it's been done by Rauge and Lekisi and others, what you get is that curve for the net energy gain as a function of EROI. And what you find is that wind and nuclear and PV are all, in most cases, much greater than 10. Another study by Lekisi et al. Compared solar PV farms in locations with low, medium and high solar. And again, all their results give EROIs greater than 10, which is what you want. So that puts an entirely different complexion on the thing. Now, before we look at the question of storage, which is quite tricky, we have to consider the EROI of fossil fuel electricity. It turns out, much to everyone's surprise, that all the work in the past that found that the EROI, the energy return on energy investment for coal and oil and gas-fired electricity, they found it was very high. And it turns out that what they did was they just looked at the EROI at the coal mine or at the gas field. But when you convert it to electricity, remember, you lose a factor of 3 or maybe 4. And it turns out, now last year Brockway et al. Did a study to find the global average EROI of fossil fuel electricity, and using my definition of EROI, which is the standard one, rather than theirs, they found that the answer was 4. So if they're correct, fossil fuel electricity has been wasting a huge amount of energy that could have gone into the economy in other ways. So therefore, the transition to renewable electricity may actually benefit other economic sectors. Now before we get to storage, yes, I'll just mention in passing, because time is limited, one of the main myths trotted out by the politicians and the Murdoch press about renewables. They claim we need baseload power stations, and that's coal, a code for coal or nuclear, in order to get reliable systems. Well, this claim has been busted now by practical experience in South Australia, because right now it's arguable that you haven't got any baseload power stations left, or at least your remaining stations are not operating as baseload. Your 2 coal stations are essentially shut down, and Torrens Island, the originally baseload gas, is not operating continuously as baseload. Baseload means 24/7 power. So that claim is also refuted by computer simulations done by scores of groups around the world, models of the operation of electricity grids with 100% renewable energy. And our group at UNSW is one of the groups that's been doing that, and this is the results of one of our studies. The pie diagram shows the percentage of contribution from wind and solar, etc., over a year. I think that was 2016. And you can see if you add the wind and solar together, it's 78%. Variable renewables contributing 78% of the electricity averaged over a year, and the system is reliable. And it's reliable because the renewables were balanced by existing hydro, 7%, in this case concentrated solar thermal with thermal storage, 8%, and gas turbines burning renewable fuels, 7%. So what it shows is you don't need a vast amount of storage. Those dispatchable renewables that balance the variables are quite sufficient with 78% variable renewables. Andrew Blakers and colleagues at ANU got a reliable system with 90% variable renewables, but they needed more storage, much more storage. Our storage was equivalent to 2 hours of annual electricity demand. I think from memory theirs was equivalent to about 19 hours of annual electricity demand. Okay, now, just to try and pull this together. Now, the storage issue. Well, the first point I've already made, that you don't need a vast amount of storage to balance renewables, especially if you've got an electricity grid that is geographically dispersed. So most of the time, the wind is blowing somewhere on the system and making a significant contribution. The second point to make is that really for this type of analysis, there are two types of storage. There are storage which actually are net generators of electricity and so have an EROI greater than 1, usually much greater than 1, once through hydro, concentrated solar thermal with thermal storage, and gas turbines burning renewable fuels in this case. The other types of storage have EROIs less than 1, and they are batteries and pumped hydro and compressed air storage, because on the superficial analysis, you're putting more energy into the system than you get out. There'll be some losses when you pump water from a higher reservoir to a low reservoir. But wait a minute. You have to take into account that, for example, for pumped hydro, a lot of the, possibly all the energy used for pumping the water uphill would be excess renewable energy that otherwise would be thrown away. So in that case, you can't count it. And so in that case, that type of storage would not be such a burden from the point of EROI on the whole system. Okay, very quickly, the last couple of minutes, what are the key policies we need? And again, Malcolm actually got most of these right. We create renewable energy zones to bring together areas where we have multiple wind and possibly solar and pumped hydro, for example, and then we join them to the main grid with a single transmission link. Huge savings, but the market will not do it. It has to be planned. There has to be a strategy. The Australian Energy Market Operator has proposed renewable energy zones for the whole of the so-called national electricity market, which doesn't include Western Australia and Northern Territory, and this is just a sample of some of them. So that's the first thing. And that's urgent. We need to create these zones and upgrade the key transmission lines, because right now solar and wind farms are being offloaded because there's too much congestion on some of the transmission lines, the existing ones, which badly need upgrading, and in some cases new lines. So there's a proposal for a new line to join South Australia directly to New South Wales, for example. The second thing is that we need some mechanism, at least for the near future, to facilitate the growth of renewable technologies with storage inbuilt, such as concentrated solar thermal and pumped hydro, off-river pumped hydro. And we can do that with grants from ARENA and loans from the Clean Energy Finance Corporation. That's the second requirement. The third requirement is that the rules, we have to change the objective, the structure and the rules of the national electricity market, which James alluded to earlier on, which is unsuitable for a system of millions of power stations with two-way flow of electricity, and that's complicated. I'm going to flash over these, And finally, I just want to offer a very simple way of formulating the broader problem. We can write carbon dioxide emissions from energy generation as population multiplied by consumption or generation per person, energy per person, multiplied by the technological input. So you see that simple identity. It's an identity, it's true by definition. If you cancel the P's and the E's on the right side, you get CO2 equals CO2. But disaggregating it into these three factors is very useful because each can be dealt with separate policies. So that's at one conceptual level. Now, if we go down one level, we ask, well, what's actually driving the growth in population and in the other terms? And in the population case, well, it's certainly the property and retail industries, but it's also the federal government wanting to maintain the fiction that it is not in recession economically at present. If you take GDP per person, we are in recession. The only reason that officially we're not is that population is driving GDP up. On the right-hand side, we've got pressure from the fossil fuel, minerals and incumbent electricity industries to keep energy consumption per person up, that's the E over P, and to keep dirty technologies, the carbon dioxide emissions per unit of energy. Let's go down one more level. What's driving these changes? One has to say it's the capitalist political economic system that puts profits before people. And the concerns about corruption. So for the long term, to transition to a more sustainable society, we actually have to deal with those systems too. So I would suggest some of the broader responses are we need to make a transition to a steady state economy. In other words, no global increase in population or energy consumption, materials and land. Thank you. And that'll have many co-benefits. And of course, that is one of the main areas of interest of ecological economics. We need to ban political donations and introduce publicly funded elections. We need a federal ICAC, but let me rush on. We need to review and reduce the powers of corporations. They have extraordinary powers. They complain about being regulated, but without the Corporations Act, they couldn't do the things that they do. The regulations are all there to help them, and that needs to be reviewed. In particular, we need to remove the mining industry's legal right to access land almost anywhere against the wishes of the owners and the custodians. And last on that list, and probably not least, is to stop the revolving door between vested interests and politicians and their political advisors. We have a situation where a former CEO of the Minerals Council of Australia is the key political advisor to one of our most senior ministers under the coalition government, and we had a situation where the energy minister under Labor is now CEO of the Queensland Resources Council, which is one of the major fossil fuel lobbies in that state. And we have to find a way to break those links. And finally, it's no use just talking. These changes will not occur unless the community at large gets up on its hind legs and puts pressure on government and on business to act. And that's it, folks. Thank you.
I saw a hand up here first.
Thanks. I was just wondering if you could comment on the concentrated solar thermal situation, because I think there was a plan for South Australia which was canned, and I'm just wondering if the technology isn't up to speed, and that seems to be photovoltaics is actually so cheap now that, where people are just doing photovoltaic systems instead of CST. But concentrated thermal technology, yeah. But just so, do you still think that's going? Because you had it on your graph as a viable technology.
Yes. I would say it's not either or. Photovoltaics has the advantage that it's incredibly cheap, but it needs storage, like battery storage, which is incredibly expensive at this stage. Photovoltaics with flat plate collectors, as I've found on my roof, generates quite well when it's overcast and even steam cast or smoke cast, and even when it's raining. So that's its advantages. But concentrated solar thermal power has cheap storage in the form of thermal storage, and that's a real advantage. But it only operates on direct sunlight because the concentrating panels obviously won't work in diffuse sunlight. I think there is a role. The initial scheme for South Australia has, the company has got into some difficulties, but it's quite possible that that'll be resurrected under another company. So it remains to be seen. There are a number of CST plants operating in the United States and Spain and in the Middle East now quite well. It's sort of ironic that the oil-producing countries now, instead of using oil to produce electricity locally, they make more profit exporting the oil, and so they're getting into concentrated solar thermal. So I don't think there's a final answer. It's not one or the other.
Hi. I'm wondering if you've got any comments on energy democratisation and the role of public versus private, and if you have any leanings towards these, given that every coal-fired power station in Australia was built by governments. Do you have any view now on what the role of government versus private is at the moment?
Yeah, coal-fired power stations were certainly built by government, and the transmission lines were built by subsidy on electricity prices to do that. If you build a wind or solar farm now, you have to pay for the connection to the main grid yourself. So yeah, there is an imbalance. Now, public versus private, it's complicated, because in the United States, which is not a model for everything, but in the electricity area, public and private operate very effectively together because there's a very strong regulatory environment, very strong, and many public hearings with public involvement. Sadly, that's not the case in Australia. So you can run a private system with strong regulation, but the problem, as I see it, is regulatory capture, the revolving door problem, and that's really serious. Now, some things I think should not be privatised. I mean, the early days of electricity, you would have, in some streets, you would have 3 different companies running power lines down the street. Obviously ridiculous. And similarly with the renewable energy zones, they're an attempt to get away from the market in the case of strategically planning where you put in your renewable energy technologies and saving money to avoid duplication. So I'm not giving you a straight answer. I think it is complex. Sorry.
Is this working? Yes. My name's Janet McCalman. I'm an historian, but I also of Australia, but also I pioneered for 20 years a course in the ecological history of humankind. So I've been thinking about these things for a very long time. The thing that's worrying me about this conference is that we're talking about the environment and nature as a sort of politics-free zone. Now, most of the things we want done will have to be done by government, a government that's got a strong mandate. The last election was a catastrophe for Australia. It is possible that a centre-left government will not be elected for at least a decade again. And you're going to be stuck with having to persuade the Liberals to do all this unless you are prepared to work to rebuild the left and not do it thinking you can have a new party or a new movement, but to use the existing structures we have, which do comprise people. If 1 million people joined the Labor Party in this coming year, you would change the Labor Party. You would change the balance of power in the country. And I'm serious about this because we have a representative democracy. And for all its faults, the Labor Party within it is a representative democracy. You really can make policy change if you are prepared to work with other people in solidarity from the bottom. And that is what Lean has done brilliantly. with grassroots politics, involving everybody in the party, talking with the unions and understanding the complexity of all, and they changed the policy. Now, I'm concerned...
Sorry, could you
Yes, I
ask
know,
a
but
question?
this is important because we're pretending we can do all of this. We can't do any of it without a government that is receptive generally and pushed by a back party. So in a sense, we've got to get rid of our ideological narcissism, which is what many of us suffer from, bite the bullet, bite our tongues, put up with all the things which are not acceptable in the Labor Party and change it.
Okay, I agree with you partially, but it's simply not true that everything has to be done by government. The growth of rooftop solar has been done mainly by the people. The huge rapid growth now of renewable energy being bought by big business and the commercial sector hasn't depended on government. The areas that we do need government for are the areas I mentioned, the renewable energy zones and transmission lines. That need some government funding to go into that. We do need government to play a role in changing the rules for the national electricity market. It's unavoidable, and yet it probably needs a COAG, the federal and state and territory governments all to come to an agreement, which is a huge challenge. But beyond that, an enormous amount is happening without government simply because renewables are now getting so cheap. So I partially agree and partially disagree. Sorry. Oh, well, that's enough. We're all serious.
Well, I mean, in lots of your economical modelling, I think the use of the private car and the growth of the energy used by them and the inefficiency too, which is increasing. Private spending is mainly done by cars. So I think if you balance it out over the world population, Australia should cut the cars by 2/3, so only 25% of the cars should be there. Australian cars also get a lot bigger and more inefficient, and I think the modelling that some have done, the damage that cars do, not just by CO2 emissions, but by taking up public space, by getting rid of or making it impossible to, have trams there. Brisbane had the most trams, and they deliberately got them rid of cars. So I would like to see a modelling that takes that into account as well, and so far everyone seemed to shy away from that. So, okay, thanks.
Just a quick response that, as Tony Sieber said in the film 2040 that some of us saw last night, really the shift to electric vehicles will happen extremely quickly. Already it is far cheaper to operate an electric vehicle than a fuel-driven vehicle, and the capital cost will come down very rapidly. So maybe in 3 or 5 years it'll suddenly happen. We also mustn't overlook the need for decent public transport. There's a great need for improvement at that. Better facilities for cycling and walking. All of these are important as we concentrate our cities.
Can you please comment on how you feel the national electricity market is hindering the transition to renewables? Because you've hinted at that. Can you tell us specifically what you mean by that?
This is a topic for a lecture in itself, but very simply, it doesn't have an objective, a climate science objective embedded in it, and that allows talk about technology neutral responses, and that allows coal and oil, or particularly coal and gas, to have a say in the whole thing, which I think we're past. At a micro level, we're in a situation that as the amount of renewable energy grows in the grid, such as in South Australia, where you're somewhere like 55%, maybe close to 60% already of your annual electricity coming from renewables. As it grows, it pushes down the wholesale price of electricity. That's the way the market works. And initially, that's good news, because it's helped to get rid of your 2 coal-fired power stations, almost get rid of them, and it'll soon get rid of Torrens Island, your former baseload gas station. The problem is that as renewable contribution continues to grow even further, it pushes the price down to such a low level that it's too low to pay off the capital costs of even wind and solar. And that's the way the market is designed, so it needs to be restructured. So that's just one of the examples, and it's a very difficult one. And some of the solutions that are being offered are solutions to prop up coal, basically. So I think that's probably all I can say in the time available, but we need a whole change, a relook at a market which was designed for an entirely different situation, with a few large stations feeding power one direction to consumers, to now millions of stations, power stations, including rooftops, feeding power both ways, and you need a different market structure, different rules, and you need rules that are not technology neutral at this stage. And we should fight against technology neutral, because it could be disastrous. There.
Okay. I'm really sorry for those people who didn't get a chance to ask Mark a question, but could you please put your hands together for Mark? Okay. And enjoy lunch.